It's really an honor to be here in Cape Town. I've been here for 10 days, and I have to say this is just a really beautiful city. Thank you for inviting all of us to be here. I'm a designer. I'm very proud to be a designer, and I'm not so sure every day what that means anymore. So I thought I'd talk today in a very personal way about a journey over the last decade in design. And it's really about going from being a designer who is making things to starting to be a designer who asks the question, how can design start to have an impact on the world around us? 67 days ago, I left New York in a snowstorm and flew to Hong Kong to begin a trip around the world. We're going to end up in Rome where we won a fellowship, and I'm going to spend 10 weeks there. But the kind of deal with my family was that we'd take our children out of school and we would make this trip and try to spend some time in some parts of the world we haven't been. Try to spend some time not in Europe, not in America. So we started in Hong Kong and then we're in Vietnam. We just came from 5 weeks in India. We packed 360 malaria pills. We're overweight recently for $130, about 1,000 rand, I think, because we had 36 kilos of cables and computer cords in our bag, plus Kindles and Blackberries and all that, plus 2 kids. I was fortunate to spend 5 days at the Indian Institute of Management. This building is designed by Louis Kahn. It's just an unbelievably beautiful place to spend some time for a Yale School of Management conference on social entrepreneurship. I was the only designer there, which is sort of, I think, becoming the story of my life. I am the only designer often in a room, and it's hard because it's hard to be persuasive in these crowds of people that don't know what design is. We went from there to, there's actually no pictures online of the National Institute of Design in India, which was conceived of by Ray and Charles Eames. This year is their 50th anniversary, so it was a very exciting thing to spend 2 weeks here teaching. And then we went to Mala Mala and saw these baboons, and then this is our travel blog called Winter House World Tour, where you can follow all the funny candy packaging my daughter finds around the world. But this one says day 63, in which we were assaulted by a penguin and our car was ransacked by baboons. I'm actually not kidding. The big one ran off with my passport. The little one ran off with my wife's medicine. The passports upset me enough, I actually took on the baboon and I won. And I lived to see that day. But we went to the end of the world. If you're not from South Africa, this is like the end of the world. I mean, it's like really beautiful. So anybody who's visiting here like we are, I mean, this is just like the most beautiful drive. You have to make this drive. But I don't live here. Back where we are, there's, I think my office reported that we had 16 inches of snow on the ground. It snowed 2 inches last night. We have our own animals. This is a black bear that lives on our land. We call him George. He comes about every 2 or 3 months because we live in the mountains in the middle of nowhere. And the story I'm trying to tell is the story of a designer who lives in the middle of nowhere with a tiny practice. This is the studio we work in. It's perhaps one of the first modern houses in America. It was built in 1931. It was a painter's studio. And after close to 10 years of renovation, this is what it looks like. It is a kind of modernist dream if you're a designer and you like clean spaces and white walls. You know, this is really like the dream, except it's not really that nice. It usually looks like this. But in this environment, we have I have a partner, my wife and partner, Jessica Helfand, and we have 3 people that work for us. So as I talk about the work, there's a team that makes the work, but it's a small team. And we're not in a big city. We're not in Cape Town. We're not in New York. We're in the mountains. So I just want to take a couple of minutes and talk about how we got to where we are. I spent 10 years at Saatchi Saatchi working in advertising. Launched Pampers in Italy and cellular telephones in America. I then started a design firm in New York called Drenttel Doyle Partners, and for 12 years we worked on hundreds of projects, but we did things like take a stodgy old museum of decorative arts and turn it into the National Design Museum, put the 19th Amendment, which is in America the right of women to vote, to put it on the floor of Grand Central, one of the great public spaces in America, on the 75th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And then I quit my job and my company to work with my wife because I came home one night and this is what she was doing, which is the very first website for the New York Times. And we proceeded to spend a decade doing almost exclusively new media. We redesigned Netscape, we did the Times of London, we did hundreds of sites for corporations. And then something kind of happened, snapped, and it's now 7 years ago, we gave a talk at a conference in Vancouver called Culture is Not Always Popular, in which we argued that the big problem with design is that we only really acknowledge outstanding design in the realm of popular culture. We only care about design when it's hip and cool and involves tennis shoes and frothy coffee and designer clothes. But what about all the other kinds of culture? What about intellectual culture? What about literary culture? What about political culture? And we basically raised a challenge. What would happen if designers started participating in these other realms? And as a profession, we started acknowledging that work with the same veracity with which we acknowledge all that cool stuff that happens in popular culture. Half the audience booed us. A big part of the talk was basically a critique of branding, kind of arguing that all the branding in the world, like why do our universities need to be branded? I don't understand why we brand educational institutions. We should be worrying about their reputations and the quality of the outcomes they deliver to students, not worrying about how cool their logos are or what their marketing programs are. So that line became a kind of threshold. And the funny thing is, if you start saying branding is bad, people stop hiring you to do branding. So I literally, like in preparing this talk and taking this trip, I was thinking, you know, like what are the pivotal moments in a career? And I have to say this talk we gave 7 years ago in 2003 was kind of a moment. We basically put ourselves out of business. And it kind of, in a weird way, we enforced a new kind of approach to design and a new kind of client base to kind of happen. So we started working first with literary culture. This is the leading literary magazine in America, The New Yorker, which we redesigned. We did a lot of work with literary journals from the Paris Review, a foundation in Chicago, a little tiny magazine that had a subscriber base of 800 was given $200 million. So we did the strategic plan for the foundation and then relaunched this magazine, Poetry Magazine, and did a decade of work with them. But the funny thing, Michael Beirut showed earlier this morning a very, very beautiful installation in a library by an illustrator named Myra Kalman. When we asked her to do the cover of our humor issue, she said, what would happen if we just misspelled poetry? And I said, okay. So I called up and said, we're going to misspell poetry. And then a couple of days later, I got a phone call saying, well, we can't actually mail it because the name of the magazine will not match our postal regulation. So we changed the name of the corporation from the Poetry Foundation to the Pietri Foundation for 30 days, mailed the magazine, and then we changed it back. How many clients would let you do that? I mean, it's like hysterical. But we built a website and now the largest archive of poetry online in America. We started doing posters that we said, well, why do posters have to be posters? Why can't we just do them online and we'll let people print them out and put them on their refrigerator? And that led to hundreds of these. So we had this kind of office thing where these are 1 hour projects. You get a poem and you get 1 hour and you make a poster. And we did hundreds of these over a couple of years. And then since corporations aren't going to hire us anymore, we started working with universities. So a sequence of projects with a number of universities. This is the journalism school at New York University, This is a leading environmental site now funded by Yale University, the new site for the Harvard Law Review. This is at the New School, a conference on the future of food. This is a poster to convince the elderly to get flu shots. And in our region of the world, we increased with this poster. We dropped 400,000 of these and increased the inoculation periods by 67%. This is a poster with a wasp's nest, a hornet's nest, from outside our studio that next to where that bear was. We grew this hornet's nest, and it became a kind of metaphor for sustainability. So there's a lot of these kinds of projects. Recently, we were one of 50 designers asked to do a poster for the 60th anniversary of probably the most famous piece of graphic design in America, which are a series of posters done during World War II by an artist named Norman Rockwell called The Four Freedoms, in which he showed people enjoying their Thanksgiving meal, having a big turkey, and that was, to recommend freedom of religion or freedom of speech or, the basic freedoms in a democracy. 49 designers reinterpreted those freedoms. I don't understand this actually, but 49 of designers reinterpreted those freedoms and did exactly the same freedoms that Norman Rockwell did in 1944 in America. And I don't know, it just never entered our mind that we would do the same freedoms that existed during a war 50 years ago when there's new freedoms being challenged today. So we did a poster about about what is freedom in the online world, what is freedom in the networked world. We do a lot of work in what we call citizen journalism. So this is our clients for this project were 18 and 21. One was a high school student, one was in a university, and they started the largest site in America to cover the politics of the election called Scoop 08. And that led to a series of projects we did involving more citizen journalism. This one is a project we started to photograph every polling place in America on Election Day. It was called the Polling Place Photo Project. It was an online initiative where you could go vote and take a picture of what happened when you voted. How many people were standing in line, what time of day was it, what kind of ballot did you use. We made a partnership with the New York Times, which put, this is on, in 2008, on Election Day when Obama won. It was on the homepage of the New York Times. And the remarkable thing was we had really amazing photographs. This is from Aperture magazine. It also ran an Idea magazine in Japan, a portfolio of photographs taken by average citizens all across the country. The funny thing about this is I've been traveling. So we saw a municipal election in India one day and went into the polling place and we took pictures. And I'm like thinking, the act of voting, what voting looks like in countries, what it looks like in South Africa, what it looks like in Europe, what it looks like in India. It's like a messy thing. It's about millions and millions of people coming out and trying to do that act of voting in some way. And when you take pictures of it, you actually find out that it's moving. People find it, the first time somebody votes is a very moving experience in their life. But anyway, it became this huge archive. At the same time, increasingly, we found that design itself was becoming the topic of our practice. We started writing about what is graphic design, for example. This is an article we wrote for Dwell magazine. I was on the board of the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum, and we helped start what are now called the National Design Awards. There are a couple people in this audience who have won them, including Mr. Beirut. The trophy for it is a metaphor for typography that becomes an object of industrial design, told through the lens of technology. So the trophy for it is actually an asterisk stretched into a three-dimensional shape. Cast out of silicon carbide, which is the hardest material that man makes, which is what Intel makes trays out of to make computer chips. At the same time, at some point, we started saying one of the problems with design is there's not, unlike architecture actually, there is very little critical writing about design. There are very few good, really, really great design writers. There's very few places in the popular press where you can read about design. There's very few newspapers that write about design. So what happens if we start an award, and we created the Winter House Writing Awards, which are a series every year. We give a $10,000 prize in America for the best writing, as well as 2 student awards. And it's been a remarkable experience to do this, because the writers, we have hundreds of submissions, but every year there's a writer that emerges, and every year that writer seems to end up with, like, a new career starts to happen. And it's not the prize. I think it's just the act of having been acknowledged at that point in their career. Somehow the writing takes on a new form and a new shape. We started our own journal to write about design. This is the first volume, which is a history of literary journals, the whole notion of what is a volume 1, number 1. And then 7 years ago, we started a blog with our partner Michael Beirut, Jessica and I and Michael, and it's 7 years. We've written probably 3,000 essays, not the 3 of us, but all our various contributing writers. And this is a piece Michael wrote about designing through the recession. Massimo Vinelli, I think, is here someplace, and this is a piece that Jessica Helfand wrote about writing Massimo when she was a student and actually getting a personal note back from him and the impact that made on her, and talks about the kindness of strangers. I tend to write more didactic rants. This is a plea in America that Obama name a designer to run the National Endowment for the Arts, which of course he didn't do, but it was a noble cause. And then a year ago, we redesigned Design Observer and started a whole bunch of new channels. So now we're writing about urbanism and architecture. We're writing about social innovation. We have 3 new editors. And now it's closer to a media company than a blog. But it's still this question: where are we going to find the voices to help us understand what design means in our life and how it can have a greater impact on the life around us? And we're basically, it's an ongoing conversation. There's no answer to those questions. So what I'd like to do for the rest of this talk is speak a little bit to this quote. This is a good friend of ours in New York named Alan Chochinoff, who runs a site called Core 77. And Alan's an industrial designer, and he recently told me, you know, he spent an entire life as an industrial designer thinking that his job was to make things. And he doesn't believe that's true anymore. And so we started asking ourselves, so what's it mean to be in the consequence business? And I want to sort of pick up on just sort of a little side note. I think as designers, we often think that the things, if you're a designer and you have a practice, or you're a designer and you work in a corporation, there's this like notion, oh, I'm going to take a little bit of my time and do good work. I'm going to do that over here while I make a living over here. Michael was talking this morning about the Robin Hood Foundation. I've sort of, having nothing to do, not knowing he was going to talk about that, I want to talk about the Robin Hood effect, which is that I think of it as like the Tibor Kalman syndrome. You work for big corporations, steal from them, take as much money as you can, and then you do the work you really want to do. Another way to think of it is the Catholic model, where the church says you have to give 10% of your life to the church. So, you know, there's like public architecture in America is trying to convince every architecture firm in America to give 1% of their practice to social causes. So I think of this as like going to church and, you know, putting 10% in the basket, the tithing model. And then there's just what they call pro bono. And so here the idea is, I'm going to do good work with a little bit of my time, and but I'm going to like treat it as if it's a charity. I'm doing good work. It's not what I do for a living, but it's the thing I'm going to do on the side that's good for the rest of the world. And I think I want to argue very powerfully today that these models fail because they don't lead to the kind of expertise and deep engagements that lead to significant scalable change. So I want to give an example. 20 years ago, a young woman right out of college came to us and asked us to do an identity for a thing called Teach for America. Their mission was that one day, all children will have the opportunity to attain an excellent education. They started with 500 teachers in their first year, and 20 years later, they have 5,000 teachers. It's a 2-year program. It's now harder to get into Teach for America than it is to get into Harvard. 13% of the top 180 colleges in America, 13% of the recent college graduates applied to Teach for America, and only 1% of them got in. These are, I mean, staggering numbers. This is the most elite core of young people in America. But the point I'm trying to make is that it took them 20 years to go from 500 people to 5,000 people. Meanwhile, we have 1 million teachers in America. So where's the impact there? Well, the impact is actually in this slide. So what we forget about is that every teacher that spent 2 years of their life, every young person that gave up 2 years of their life to go work in a school in a disadvantaged area to try to bring a good education to a child that might not otherwise receive it, is now a part of something. They're a part of a core of people that have had that experience. And remarkably, the new curve is that 30,000 people have done that. And now there's 5,000 people a year, so this number will be 50,000. And by the end of Obama's first administration, there will be close to 50,000 people that have taught in the worst school districts in America. So if I think about like design and all the projects that we read about and all the social networking that involve weekend projects where you go do a cool thing in a school, I want to argue that this is actually what we have to be thinking about. How do we get to this kind of scale? The powerful thing about this is that they actually now know a lot. They know about how to train teachers. They know how to recruit teachers that are effective in the classroom. It's not a given that just because you're a smart student that makes you a good teacher. So there's 20 years of learning there, and now we're taking that learning around the world. And I'm privileged to be on a leadership team with 6 other people running Teach for All, which is now in countries around the world. As a designer, there was a fascinating thing. So we're going to go into Lebanon, we're going to go into India, we're going to go into Germany, and help a local social entrepreneur start their own teaching program. And you start asking yourself, well, what's the branding of Teach for All? What's that logo I need to make for Teach for All that's going to identify us and help those places become more effective? And my conclusion was, actually, we don't want to brand them. We don't actually want another logo that's going to compete with their local identity in those countries. So we created basically no logo. We basically said we're going to live online, because that's where this communication is going to happen. And we're a network, so we're just going to exist at the level of the browser. And we're going to work with a type designer named Peter Bielak, because he's the first designer. There's only 2 or 3 designers really working on taking font design international. The font we're using is Phaedra. It was just released its first version in Hindi. So we're already trying to figure out how do we do communications in all these countries in the local languages, and working with a font designer to do that. And these are all the countries we're in today, 24 months after starting. So it's been a remarkable, I have to say it's a privilege. It's a privilege as a designer to be able to work on projects like this. And the role of the designer, in a lot of cases, is not very powerful or meaningful. I mean, it's humbling, because these young people that are running this organization know how to teach children in the classroom, which is something I don't know how to do. So being a part of that has been a really exciting experience. So the rest of the talk, I'd like to speak about the idea of a post-client world. I was recently at a design summit, and a designer, a thinker in Chicago named Larry Keeley made the observation, what happens if we try to imagine a world in which, a kind of post-client world, i.e. what happens when design is not something that happens because somebody calls you and hires you. It happens because we start something. And that's basically been the work we've been trying to work on, is try to model how that can happen. 18 months ago, it's a long story, but sort of a life-changing thing happened, which is that a foundation found us and asked us if we would be willing to give up most of our clients to work exclusively on design for social innovation and to explore ways in which designers could participate in greater degrees in new ways and apply new models to develop social innovation around the world. So we've been working on a number of projects. In Rochester, Minnesota, we're working with the Mayo Clinic. Even here, you may have heard we're having a healthcare debate in America. Healthcare in America is pretty terrible, but the leading hospital in the country is probably the Mayo Clinic. And they have 50 people in an innovation center. So we're working in that innovation center are 12 designers, and there's 3 or 4 of us that are advising them, helping them try to figure out how do we actually sort of ignore the federal government, ignore the healthcare system, how do we try to rebuild healthcare from the bottom up, one city at a time, that's filled with doctors and designers who are part of an innovation center trying to apply design methodologies to the way healthcare is run. I never would have thought in my lifetime that a designer would be sitting at a table as a peer of a doctor. I mean, it's a kind of remarkable thing. In India, we're doing a case study on a solar energy company called Selco, which has brought solar energy to 400,000 homes in Bangalore. And so part of the project now is to try to identify and actually do case studies that can be taught in schools. So if you go to Harvard, to the business school, we have really great case studies about the Coke battles, Coke-Pepsi battles. But we don't have any case studies about the future of solar energy. So we're trying to actually develop case studies with a design point of view and publish these. And the radical thing that's happening, that's the most exciting part of it, is that we've actually convinced Yale and the schools we're working with to publish these under a Creative Commons license so that any school in the world can use these for free. This is actually the head of Selco, and I was in India last month, and I brought him this bag from PopTech. There's 100 prototypes of a bag. That's a solar panel in that bag, and with that bag, you can open it up, and a little tiny LED light can light a room off the reflective surface on the inside of the flap so that children can read at night, or you can recharge your cell phone. So we're talking with Hamish Harande about whether or not he can make these in India. This is a Design Observer story about a conference in 1970, in the Aspen conference. It was a conference of a whole bunch of white men sitting around talking about the future of design. And the funny thing is, the story, we published this a couple of years ago, and the story is that outside of Aspen, there were all the 1960s radicals came, and they weren't allowed in. And so there was a counter-Aspen, an anti-Aspen conference that happened outside. And I thought it was really an inspiration. So we actually decided we're going to hold our own Aspen Summit. Only we curated a series of projects, and we brought 70 people together to work on rural poverty, childhood obesity, and we brought in partners, the Center for Disease Control, the Mayo Clinic, the government of Alabama, a very poor state in the American South, UNICEF. We did a project with menstruating girls in East Africa, and we held a summit where we just said, why do we have conferences where we just, I mean, it's really great to come and learn. I will learn from the speakers here, and I will learn from meeting people here. But what would happen if we had a conference where we said we're actually going to try to design outcomes that could be implemented within the next 24 months? And that's not, I mean, I don't know that it will work, but that's the goal. So I want to play this video quickly.
you here, and we're absolutely delighted that all of you, every one of you is here, because I think that this is one experience where we don't make it happen, we let it happen. What we're doing here in Aspen has to do with using design to stimulate social innovation.
There's amazingly talented people here, and you put them together and we could actually make really concrete design-oriented programs that could have a huge impact.
Our goal is frighteningly simple, but anytime you can boil your mission down to something really simple, you know you have a huge challenge on your hands.
I think one of the only answers to solving some of these big issues is human ingenuity, invention, creativity, and that comes for me under the umbrella of design.
The designer has the ability to not only reframe the challenge, but also try to find ways to transform some of its elements.
It was not simple to get to these insights, but frankly, had we not gone through the process, we wouldn't have gotten where we got to.
We started with a challenge of a kid that had the value to have child development. And in reality, our goal is to have the value of the child development without the kid.
We're looking at a more net-like distributed system for how healthcare or how well-being is actually manifest in this community.
This transformation is clearly about health and changing the obesity numbers and galvanizing all kinds of attention and excitement and real transformation in communities, but it's also about economic development.
Those are just 4 of the what-ifs that we've played with. There's about 45 others that you're not seeing here, but that should give you an idea of some of the creative thinking that's gone into this.
It was just so chaotic, but then at the end of it, we just came out with something really, really good that we will take forward and really start applying in the field.
This is part of the design process. This is part of the process that they were expecting of us as well.
You need players who are already engaged. You need a CDC, you need a Mayo, you need a Hale County, you need a group which are excited and committed to seeing how this process can be implemented.
And with real scale. So, we want to work with places like the CDC because the goal is, what would happen if we could actually do a healthy aging program that went through every public health facility in the country?
It's a long journey. At the same time, people are quite fascinated to see how many steps. In 24 months are we here.
These kind of collaborations are critical, not just because of their social value, but because they are really driving our understanding of design.
It's about making a public space. It's about working in the public realm. It's about working for change.
The potential of that is just fundamentally exciting. So in my studio, we'd been working on projects like this for a number of months, and one day one of the designers sort of yelled down at me and sort of said, "So Bill, what does design for social innovation actually look like? Like, meaning as a designer, what do we actually get to make? Are we ever going to get to design anything, or is it always going to be meetings?" This is me at that's the Empire State Building in New York behind me, and this is a meeting in which we're trying to model how small firms can participate in projects like this. I think most of the meeting was talking about intellectual property. My point is, it's a lot of meetings and a lot of whiteboards and a lot of Post-it notes. And the designer in me wants, at some point, there's a struggle between the designer in me that wants to make things and wants to make beautiful things, and the designer in me that wants to be a thinker and participate in new realms in work I don't know how to do. So that's what we've been doing and what I've been thinking about on this trip, and I can't wait to go back and get back to work. I'd like to end with a short video. I'm an American. Maybe one of the high points of my life was the last election. I mentioned the Polling Place Photo Project. I thought I'd show some of the photographs of what voting looks like in America. And I'm going to end on this note.